I want to talk about two officers in the Second Seminole War who were virtually erased from history. And the reason why I say that is both of these officers died in Florida during the Second Seminole War by their own hand. A melancholy affair. It's the description usually describe it back in those days. And of the soldiers, regular army killed in Florida or died in Florida during the Second Seminole War. They are not listed in John T. Sprague's book, The Florida War, so they're not among the 1,466 office, officers and soldiers who died during the Florida War, which makes it very significant. I've happened to find these by accident when I was researching on the adjutant records on microfilm and just came across their uh, adjutant letters describing what happened to him. And before I get into that, I want to mention that the state funding has cut the resources of the state library, so it makes it very bad for people doing genealogical or historical research. For example, they had cut funding for Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, and Fold 3, which makes it very difficult for people doing research into their ancestors because these records were widely used. So resources that you used to be able to use for free at the state library are now going to cost you about $500 a year if you want to subscribe to the websites. So it's very disappointing, and it shows that cuts in library does matter for people doing research. I mean, a lot of people might not consider that important, but for people doing genealogy research, it's actually especially important for that. So anyway, so these officers, they're not in Sprague. They are just very briefly listed in Heitman's historical register and dictionary of the U.S. Army because it mentions the officers in here as it does all the Army officers from 1789 to 1903. In fact, I had an original copy of the book that I uh, donated to the Seminole War Library that went to Fort King, which actually had checked off uh, in the early 1900s which of the officers from the Civil War were still alive and which were dead. And it was signed in the front as a collection of the officer who was the superintendent, I think, of Yosemite at that time, which is pretty cool. But this is a great resource. It's online digitally at Hathi Trust, Google Books, and also on Fold 3. I just got my own hard copy because I research it so much. So the first officer we're going to talk about was at Steinhatchee, Fort Frank Brook. And let's go to Steinhatchee here. Steinhatchee, it's a kind of a coastal community on the Gulf Coast, between Fort Fanning and Perry. If you're going down Highway 1998, you have to take a road that goes kind of south to Steinhatchee. It's a side road. It's kind of a remote fishing village, and Fort Frank Brook was about as remote as it could get back then. I imagine a very, very remote post. So the first officer we're talking about is Lieutenant Charles Hughes, and he died on August 22nd, 1839. Interesting history about him. He is 21 years old when he died. Charles John Hughes was born in 1818. Find a Grave website says he was born in the Marshall Islands, but I don't see where they had gotten that information or anything else to verify it. His father was a U.S. diplomat in Stockholm, Sweden, so he did have the political connections, and he was appointed to West Point in 1834 at age 16. And at West Point, he wanted to be with the Engineering Corps, but he was finally appointed to the 6th Infantry, probably because he was not at the top of the class. He graduated in the class of 1838, 37 out of 45, so he was kind of near the bottom of the class. It's interesting that one of those who was at the top of the class, who did get an engineering position, was P.T. Beauregard, who we know also more famous during the Civil War. And I've actually been in his house in New Orleans. We had a reenactor wedding there in 2000. But Charles Hughes was commissioned a second lieutenant 6 months after graduation in January 1839. It's not unusual to take a few months between leaving West Point until they're commissioned. Hughes asked for leave of absence due to twisting his ankle falling off a horse, but it doesn't seem like this was granted. Um, they're the you know he went to Florida and was at Florida for about 6 months and was at Fort Frank Brook most of this time apparently. And here's the kind of the obituary mentioned in an article in Niles National Register. He died on was I said August 22nd, 1839. There was only a small company at Fort Frank Brook at the time. The officers present listed are Lieutenant Hughes and the Assistant Surgeon Benjamin Woods. No other officers and 33 men, so about half the size of a company. Company was made up of soldiers of different companies from the 6th Infantries. Uh, Dr. Woods writes that he was tending to the sick in the hospital about 7:30 in the morning when he heard a strange noise and ran into the quarters of Lieutenant Hughes and found that he had uh, cut his neck with his knife and was expiring in bed as Dr. Woods ran in. Unfortunately, could not save him. Met a melancholy end, as they say in the language of the time. It's believed that Charles Hughes is buried at St. Francis Barracks, the cemetery in St. Augustine. It's not marked anywhere, but I saw that when we were trying to research the records of who is actually in the pyramids there. So he's probably among the officers buried in the pyramids, as would be this next officer we want to research. The next officer is Second Lieutenant Ephraim Thayer, who was at Fort Shannon. Fort Shannon is in Palatka on the St. Johns River. Uh, don't believe most of what you see on the historical marker. It's a lot of it's incorrect. So I'm not going to talk about that today. Could say that the next officer is Second Lieutenant Ephraim M. Thayer, who died on September 16th, 1841 at Fort Shannon in Palatka, and found somewhat of a nice obituary in the Cleveland Daily Herald, also called the News and the Herald. So kind of interesting history, Lieutenant Thayer. I don't have as much on him because he did not graduate from West Point. He was actually appointed a commission in the Army. Um, he was appointed to the 2nd Dragoons in December 1839. So he was in the Army less than 2 years, about a year and a half or so. It says he was from Ohio. He was not wealthy, but very industrious and ambitious to obtain his goals. Uh, it says that as a young man, age 14, he moved to Ohio with his mother and sisters, started a farm on credit, and became successful doing that and wanted a commission in the Army and was recommended due to his very positive and ambitious attitude. He, as I mentioned, he did not go through West Point, but back then, another way to get a commission in the Army is you go through a board of examination of U.S. officers, and Lieutenant Thayer did so well. He was kind of at the top of the list of those in the board, did much better than those who were of wealth and connection. So it's kind of a U.S., United States, American success story. He asked to be appointed to the 4th Infantry, but was appointed to the 2nd Dragoons instead. Um, he went through training at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. In Florida, he spent most of the duty along the St. Johns River and Ocklawaha River, was at Fort Mellon, and of course at Fort Shannon when his life ended. Uh, when his uh, when this melancholy act, as we shall call it, occurred, according to Major Fauntleroy of the 2nd Dragoons, said that even up to his death, he seemed cheerful and contented. Uh, it's like one evening they heard a carbine fire, and they went and found that he had ended himself with his carbine. A board of inquiry was organized to ascertain the cause of his melancholy act, but unfortunately, they were unable to tell what was the reason that he did this. So, those are two two cases of officers that virtually disappeared from history. They're not in Sprague. Thayer is also in the book about the 2nd Dragoons, the 2nd Cavalry from Everglades to Canyon, with the 2nd United States Cavalry by Theophilus Rodenberg. I got this copy on Amazon. It was first printed in 1875. It's an excellent resource for anyone researching the 2nd Dragoons, so or the 2nd Cavalry. So I found that interesting of two officers who were uh, erased from history and disappeared that really nobody's known about. It seems like they were buried in St. Francis in the pyramids with the other officers who died in the war in Florida. But I thought you might find that interesting that sometimes the historical record does not tell the whole story and does not mention everyone. So it's always a rabbit hole you can go down researching, and I thought you might find this interesting.